Yes, yes. Lovely. Thank you very much for staying with us and being here also after the coffee break. It's now time to have, I think, a very interesting and valuable keynote speech by the distinguished professor of the University of California, Ted Porter, that's gonna talk about the pursuit, as I was saying before, maybe not happiness, but close to this, or at least it's hard as happiness to find it, the pursuit of objectivity in science and public life. This is, I think, a very, very critical topic. Maybe it's a chimera, maybe not. We're gonna know something about this very soon. But I would like to ask Professor Ted Porter to come on stage and give him, of course, a warm welcome and a round of applause.
Do I start this, or it's me? So anyhow, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure, and if I say a humbling privilege or something, that is totally the truth. First, because here I am, a historian at a conference on the future, so the past has some relationship to the future, and I hope that will show up in a useful way. I also hope that that this question of objectivity, which has become, so what's objectivity? Sounds like it must be pretty good, but it actually there are different ways of understanding it, and it has a historical development, and we can kind of see in the work that we do, perhaps competing senses of what this should mean, and decisions for people like, well, you know, all kinds of people who are engaged in making knowledge, and the statistical offices are a very special version of that. I've been interested in that for a long time, I wanted to say one other thing by way of introduction, and that was how pleased I was to see in the first survey the narrative. That is, what else what's important for statistics to provide to make the statistics meaningful and narrative was right there. I didn't actually expect that. I think it's to your, you know, it's to your credit, or at least a recognition of the importance of other ways even of presenting data. We can say at the same time that if I give you a narrative, I might need to give a narrative, or I might need to give some other kind of information, so you would believe that this was something that mattered. One more preface, and that is the title, actually, which of my talk, with the pursuit of objectivity in science and public life, was the title of a book I wrote a long time ago. It's perhaps long enough ago that it doesn't count as advertising for me to put the book up there, and it was, in a way, it's absolutely consistent with my interest for a long time in the history of statistics, which is also about the role that statistics has in the world. It is also you know, about the ways that you know, this objectivity is a way of interpreting it and thinking about what it means for professionals, for knowledge makers of various kinds. Statistics is a special kind of knowledge, and yet part of a big world of knowledge. So we'll proceed with that. So I can come there. So I wanted to say objectivity. Actually, these 19th century founders of statistics as a field of knowledge in London, but it happened in much of Europe and a bit of North America, perhaps at the same time. Actually was associated also with official knowledge about colonial situations, so it's widespread. But they, the founders of the Statistical Society of London, which is the ancestor of the Royal Statistical Society, at about, so it's in the early 1830s, at about the time when the British had formed a new organization of science, the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and were a little nervous about their standing. And then up shows, you know, here's the statistical, the statistics shows up. Here in Belgium, we'll see, I'll show you Ketele's picture in a minute, but here in Ketley comes to the, who's also an astronomer, came to the meetings of the Statistical Society, of the British Association, and actually helped to organize the approval of a statistical section of this society. A year or two later, it became an independent society as well, but the statistical section persisted and still there, although it changed. After a while, it added economic sciences to its title, but it was a social science. This field of statistics, you probably all know that the stat in statistics is the state. Actually, and then there were great etymological debates about what that state meant. But anyhow, it was clearly a social science, and that made the British Association nervous because they were worried that it might look like a political organization rather than a scientific one, that it might compromise the integrity or at least the reputation of this new society, which was trying to defend science as something that was important for the state, that was important for the world, and that had something to value, but that also had an independent status. So could statistics have this kind of independent status? Well, they chose a certain kind of pose of objectivity to defend themselves. This part of the story is well known. They took a sheaf of wheat as their emblem, and they used the Latin phrase alias exterrendum. Is that? You can see it. You can see it on the banner of the left-hand one. Alias exterrendum, which in Latin means means to be threshed out by others. And actually, also not at the British Association, but in the meetings of the society, they also passed a resolution that the society would be concerned with facts, and would not. That no expressions of opinion would be allowed at the meetings of the Statistical Society. Well, a satirist and commentator said, well, there's no reason to worry about this. Opinion is just a Latin word for thought, and there's not too much thinking happening at the Statistical Society that we can see. So, but there was a reason for this sheaf of wheat, and for the attempt to draw back from opinions, and it was exactly that they were, in a way, defining or trying to extend the domain of science, and they were worried that they would be taken to be, rabble-rousers or political actors rather than people who were defending some kind of neutral, impersonal, a higher ideal of knowledge. Could they achieve the same kind of knowledge ideal as the natural sciences had? And now they actually, after a while, they kept the sheaf of wheat, but you see they gave up this slogan of to be threshed out by others. Statistics would have to do some threshing out of knowledge itself, and yet the nervousness about the impersonality of knowledge, about being objective rather than being a political actor, persists. I was Margot Anderson, who will be on, I guess later. Maybe I think tomorrow. I was looking at her book about debates in the U.S. About the book with Stephen Feinberg about debates in the United States about the census and about using sampling in the census at the end of the 20th century. And in the hearings there are great discussions about whether statistics was sufficiently technical. So that word technical is standing in now for a kind of ideal of objectivity. Are they driven by their technical methods, or is there room for them to be expressing, personal opinions, political opinions instead? So it wasn't just that the Statistical Society or that statisticians thought that they shouldn't be giving their opinions. They were worried about, and are still worried about, their standing as scientific actors, in an area where there's certainly many possibilities for the expression of political disagreement. In our own time, we use data sometimes for this purpose. Now, data is a word with many uses. I was surprised to learn that it's quite an old word. It sounds like a very modern word, but actually it's a datum was what a mathematician could assume, so it was what was given. and we push words like evidence and data again as a demonstration that instead of merely uttering our opinions, it's something about the structure of the knowledge, about its technical demands is the source of our work, rather than that it be opinion. This one is a hierarchy of knowledge. It's associated with medical research, in fact, and we have actually meta analysis at the top, and the clinical trial, the controlled clinical trial below that. But and all the stuff that doctors once thought they knew on the basis of case studies is kind of dismissed, or is put at the wide base, which by itself can't mean very much. So anyhow, it's statistics is one of those things that in some very important fields like medicine, where you think they would think they know what they're doing, that is, and they were not too happy about statistics for a long time, have kind of capitulated to an ideal of evidence and data as the basis for proper knowing. And the phrase evidence-based, which now is applied, I haven't heard that today, I don't think, but which you find applied to all kinds of subjects, comes out of medical discussions and is associated again with the pursuit of a kind of objectivity, which is to be impersonal and to be based on data rather than merely to express our opinions. Now that to put it that way suggests that the opinions are uncertain, that we don't really want people doing that, in real life, it's not easy to have interesting knowledge that doesn't include a sense of opinion, but this idealization of a neutral objectivity, of drawing back from the opinions, reflects actually some degree of weakness among the knowledge makers who are trying to work here. That is, that if we exclude our opinions, if we just accept the data, then there's really no basis for criticizing us. So I see I put up data-driven. I have heard that a little bit, and if data-driven means that we use the data the best we can, then I think that's unquestionably a valid ideal, an ideal that we should appreciate. And if data-driven means, as it certainly sometimes seems to mean when I see it being used, if it means, no, it's not us, we who this is not just our opinions, this is driven by the data, then actually it consigns the work of, let's say, statisticians or all kinds of scientists to a kind of a minor role of merely custodians of something, rather than people whose analysis and whose thinking and whose critical engagement with the topic is necessary for knowledge to emerge from the process. So, but when in the unfortunate political situation of not only of my own country, climate scientists are accused of just letting their political views determine what they do. They say this is data-driven in a way which implies a kind of their own kind of passivity, that is, they are merely capitulating to the data. And that is a certain kind of, I mean, that kind of pose it represents a certain kind of understanding of, or a representation of objectivity, a defensive move to protect against criticism. So, and I'm going to be interested in seeing how this works in various uses. I thought I would mention here a recent, well, actually not so recent, another book on objectivity, which has become quite famous in some circles, by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, two historians of science with some philosophical interests. And they actually offer a series of stages, a periodization, we say, of objectivity. Three meanings, starting with truth to nature, ending with professional judgment, and actually within the middle, extending from the mid-19th century to about 1840 or 1850 to 1910, one they call objectivity, now the big objectivity, and that's actually quite closely related to the sense I was using. Actually, I'm not going to say they copied me. We were all talking about these things a long time before that, so we copied one another, but I didn't actually. I thought it was quite false to set up this ideal of a passive objectivity, of just capitulating to the facts, of trying to remove from knowledge one's own, a personal contribution, to assign that to the mid-19th century. I see that happening actually in our own time, or in the post-war period, more than ever before. I quite like, however, and I'll say a little bit more about this as we go, I quite like the contrast that they make between objectivity in the sense of, knowledge that is as impersonal as possible, knowledge that should be a kind of capitulation to the facts, or a capitulation to well, they're talking about images, so for instance to the ruthless camera, as opposed to giving opinions, and actually professional knowledge. And I would just emphasize that aspect of the story right now, that if objectivity is a kind of capitulation to facts, professional judgment actually definitely implies the importance of a skilled person interpreting what they're studying. That is kind of the pole, the poles within which I'm trying to analyze this concept of objectivity. One is that objectivity is exactly having the kind of skill and knowledge to read these things wisely, and one that we could, by letting the machinery produce our results, we have the most objective knowledge that we can. That book I showed you of mine puts a lot of emphasis on, it's not exactly statistics, but on the origins of the methods of cost-benefit analysis, which arose out of American administrative and political cultures, and have, and are now known, quite internationally. And that was, even more in a way than the statistical society was represented a situation of real conflict and a need, a push to have a method of calculation which should be as tightly codified as possible and should seem as impersonal as possible, in order to somehow diffuse the conflicts that grew up around these decisions about where to build and whether to build water control projects. Well, I could go on about water control projects at great length. Let's just say that that some people didn't want them, though they're famous. We use the word pork barrel for this. I'm not sure if that's an international word or not, but that means corrupt, and it's just people taking care of themselves with state money. And these were the models of the pork barrel politics. State paying for services that is the national state, the federal government paying for services that that local people would like. That could, anyhow, and though they were very popular with the Congress, they attracted some opposition. Public electric utility companies weren't happy about these projects being funded by the state and competing with them with tax money. Railroads didn't like canals being built with tax money and competing with the new railroads. And interestingly enough, different agencies also fought with each other about who should build these things, and they got tangled in terrible political conflicts and looked desperately for some kind of a way to escape from the political controversy that had grown up around these projects. And actually, so through the late 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, and actually it's still going on, the methods of analysis of costs and benefits, where they tried to develop it in a form that was sufficiently standardized that everybody should have to agree on what the outcome was, and so there would be a non-controversial way of deciding about these projects. So again, actually, it's a kind of objectivity which arising out of a situation of clear and very troubling political conflict, a way of trying to make these decisions according to rules, even if they weren't sure that they were the best rules. And so one thing that interested me in this was about the valuation of human life. That's a tricky business, and they actually used an insurance measurement for some time. That is to say, how much insurance would, if my life is lost, how much insurance would I have to, or how much would I pay for, would I insure my life for, to so that my discounted future income would be covered for my family or something. That is, they use the measure which one can hardly think that that the loss of one of our lives reduces to our our contribution to our family, but that was when they had a measure already which came from insurance and other kinds of things like how much is my life worth to me, or how much would I have to be paid to take a certain risk, couldn't be managed, didn't produce a standard figure. So objectivity meant having a measure which you could perform reliably, that is, which produced a predictable answer, which was hard to fight about, as opposed to the right thing that you might want to actually use. And environmental values, which we've just been talking about, and were also another topic. They use tourist value tourist expenditures to value the environment. It seems pretty inappropriate, but they did have measures of that, so they used it. All right. Well, I said I think that the push for highly impersonal and, in that sense, highly kind of rigorous, but not necessarily the right measure, was also much associated with the Second World War. Here's John von Neumann with his computer, and I'm not going to ascribe this to von Neumann especially, but the age of computers and actually of nuclear weapons also produced a great push for algorithms, which are, again, I think, a kind of model of the objective procedure of trying to have something which even a machine can do, even a thing as stupid as a computer. And anybody who was old enough to do a little programming in the old days realizes how much incomprehension lies behind all the sophistication of the analysis now. Here's another model, figure for a certain kind of objectivity, again associated with the need to make controversial judgments. R.A. Fisher, the great statistician, there he is with his pipe, so maybe that doesn't associate him with tobacco. Fisher developed a mode of analysis which could be used, for example, he used it first for studying agricultural crop improvements, but pretty soon it makes its way to psychology and very much to medicine. Actually, it wasn't only Fisher's method, but the ideal of a mode of analysis which would be as objective as possible, which could produce knowledge that people wouldn't blame on the individuals, but would be a part of the system. And that meant, I showed you this triangle or this pyramid of knowledge, and this kind of knowledge would be at the top of the pyramid. At that point, it would be at the top, and then meta-analysis succeeded there. But it would be a rigorous, impersonal knowledge, according to the standards of statisticians, the doctors often weren't so sure about that, but in a situation of Okay, let me just say at this point, if you think I'm saying that that the opponents of statistics are always right, I am not saying anything of the kind. But I will say that doctors weren't, on the whole, trusted their professional judgment much more than they wanted to have their treatment decisions regulated by the outcome of tests, according to the logic of statisticians. And it was something about the political situation that, again, actually the difficulty of finding a basis for regulating medicine that led to the triumph of a statistical system of drug evaluation over, doctors continuing as independent professionals exercising their judgment. So anyhow, so far I'm, kind of offering this as a rival, as inconsistent measures, and really we want to recognize some expertise on the part of the doctors, while at the same time understanding the importance of their using the best data that they have. So I already said statistics was a state science. And that medicine actually was. I think medicine is very interesting for us because we have a long-standing use of statistical results in medicine and a long-standing dis-ease about whether the statistics really should stand in the way of or should supplant the expert judgment of the professional statistician. So a kind of rivalry between expert judgment and statistical calculation. The medical profession was always a bit uneasy about this, though they were always interested at the same time. The statistical solution in this case, which I guess it's not really so relevant to the public statistics that we're mostly concerned with here, but the statistical solution was the randomized trial, so tossing a coin. Randomization had the virtue of interfering with all kinds of possible manipulation, choosing something, or assigning the patients in such a way as to favor any particular outcome, and it allowed for an error calculation. So this was good for statistics, and its logic actually in the abstract is quite compelling for us, and yet there isn't actually even the randomized trial doesn't solve all your questions. It remains quite difficult to specify the conditions of the trial in such a way that nothing can get in the way of, or that you can exclude the judgment of the expert, whether the expert physician or actually the expert statistician, who in the end, to the doctors, the statistician looks like the defender of a mechanical kind of knowledge, but you all know, I think, and I hope you recognize that statistics depends on all kinds of expert judgments along the way as well to deal with all the ambiguities that that fill the world. So in the case of a medical trial, there is a question, for instance, of what you compare it with. You have a new drug. You want to do you compare it with the alternative best option, or is it enough that do you compare it always with the placebo? Because if it is effective at all, maybe it would be worth using when a patient can't tolerate the preferred option. But once you open that up, then all the wiles of drug companies to get people or doctors to prescribe the more expensive product come into play. In fact, there isn't in fact a single answer to what the comparison should be made to. What's the right placebo, or should it be a placebo at all? As I just say, the other and perhaps still more difficult question faced in this circumstance is what do you do with patients who drop out of the trial? well, maybe they, I mean, you know, they certainly aren't random. Maybe they dropped out because they felt as if everything was good. They were, you know, the disease, whatever they were suffering wasn't bothering them anymore, so why continue the treatment? Maybe they dropped out because there was something, you know, extremely uncomfortable, or that they felt that they were getting worse. Maybe they just, you know, moved out of the area. So anyhow, it takes, you know, a clinical trial requires somebody to assess, to understand what to do with the missing data. And again, you know, you have this nice protocol which should provide an answer, and then it turns out the ambiguities creep back in. It doesn't mean that the data isn't worth anything. It just means that there's still a kind of expertise and it is medical, statistical, both, in order to reach the conclusion. Here's a thing which I'm especially interested in these days, and that is what happens when you set up a gold standard. I'm sure you all know that the clinical trial has often been and is still often called the gold standard for medical therapeutic knowledge. The randomized controlled trial is the way to do it, but once you have a gold standard, you're inviting counterfeiting. I have a picture of clipped coins, which is, I find, you know, I mean, actually, Isaac Newton, of all people, would help to create the silver coin with, you know, the beveled circle to make it hard to clip it, but the clipped coin was used for a long time, so to devalue the coin, but it still has a stamp of a certain value. So can you compromise the gold standard in statistics? And the answer was, well, yes, or it takes, you know, considerable vigilance to avoid that. So we might ask, you might think I'm unfriendly to statistics. That would be wrong. Are numbers deceitful in a way that words are not? So I'm going to say yes. They are deceitful in a way that words are not, but I think I've just skipped a slide here. Or, okay, what's going on? Anyhow, I think they are deceitful in a way that words are not, but they are not more deceitful than words. Words can be deceitful in their own ways, and we can be trying to protect ourselves from deceit at every point. The issue with numbers is exactly actually this. So here we are. So they are, especially when the numbers acquire a kind of official function. Now, there's been some discussion here, very appropriately, of you know, the relationship between the numbers that emerge from the exercise of official, you know, the function of various bureaucracies. And I understood people the consensus around here to be that these kinds of numbers, which are collected in the routine business of the work of an agency or administration, as opposed to real scientific experts, that these purely official numbers tend to be inferior. They are, however, the ones that were most readily available and remain, for many purposes, most readily available. And here, actually, we have a question like that. What if we take our numbers, which we're just trying to use to, you know, as, shall I say, scientists are just trying to use them to understand better the situation, whatever it is, trade or medicine or, you know, or the environment. But what if we, and how does it matter if instead we are trying to use these numbers to set up a system of administration? So now we actually are introducing a system of incentives with that, and that is a special kind of number, perhaps an indicator, more than an indicator. It's an indicator, but also an indicator with which perhaps rewards and penalties are associated. Well, that hope that somehow with numbers we can answer questions like, is this a good, you know, medicine? Is it a good government we are living under? You know, if the economy is getting better, does that mean we have a Does that mean we have a good government? Or is it, is a business performing well? Is it producing, social benefits? Can we use numbers for these purposes? Well, we may want to do it, but we are also introducing temptations to make the numbers deceitful. So there are lots of problems with using numbers this way. One is that we may not be measuring the right thing. Now, actually, so is Professor Giovannini still here? I mean, he and others perhaps here have been associated with the attempt to broaden the numbers that we use to assess the quality of life or the quality of government or the quality of development in different places, in different companies, in different countries, and that is to move away from the unique reliance on GDP as somehow the measure of the success of a government. There are lots of reasons to worry about using a measure like GDP, from a simple one, which we never get, that the economy doesn't respond that quickly to what any particular administration does. Otherwise, imagine the disaster that might have happened some places, but also because perhaps it's just not the right measure, it doesn't. Either you can try to broaden the sense of GDP to take in all the things that we value, or you can try to use additional measures as well. And the problems of GDP are well known. I'll just mention, since we've just been discussing the environment, that both the ordinary methods of discounting mean that what happens in a couple of hundred years is not really worth bothering with. So if we really discount things, but how can you not discount in accordance with interest rates? So it's a very tricky business. Anyhow, so it's perhaps not the right measure. Perhaps it would lead us to catastrophic consequences if we relied on GDP too much, in its classic form. Well, so actually, if GDP is going to be more than just as it were, the detached scientist, the detached statistician looking and trying to judge how things are going, or how well the economy is being managed, if instead it becomes a system of rewards, then it introduces a whole set of temptations, and that's what I want to say a little bit about here. You may be familiar with this law, so-called, which is often given. These two people are credited with different versions of this. I like Donald Campbell, but Goodhart is good. More or less that once you use a law as a basis for regulation or for a system of rewards, you introduce temptations to cheat, to clip the coin, the gold coin, in order to reap advantage from the manipulation. So, and the rule of numbers and indicators as demonstrations of the success of administrations or of regulatory regimes introduces many temptations. So for a crooked use of numbers, I think of, well, I mean, actually, I don't actually want to put myself now, clearly on the side of critics or not, but only to recognize the temptations here. Well, the PISA process of evaluating schools. Well, I mean, surely there's something, I mean, comparing schools is surely something we would be interested in doing, and literacy rates or possibly performance on certain kinds of examinations would provide some basis for making that kind of determination. But actually, any particular one. Now, the PISA process, actually, at least it doesn't have the weight of specific rewards and punishments. It's only something that will give you good press or bad press. But there are many reasons also why you might not trust a single examination. It might be, for instance, that different schools in different places have quite legitimate reasons to want to teach different sorts of things. So maybe the uniformity implied by a process like that is undercutting a legitimate kind of diversity. And the other thing is that all the things that people might do in response to the incentives created by this measure, maybe it becomes necessary for the people's self-respect or whatever schools will be pressed to teach exactly the things that are being measured and only those things, or to exaggerate that. So even a thing like literacy, if the percent of people who are literate, who could not want to have as many people as possible, as many students as possible emerge as literate? But if that becomes a very important thing that to be measured, then maybe all the other things we might like kind of sink into the shadows as those last students who might be brought up to the level to pass the literacy exam receive all the attention of teaching at the expense of everyone else. So, I don't have, so I give my kind of perspective on this. It's not like I have the answer. I perfectly well recognize that there isn't the answer, except to say that one has to be careful of the incentives that these measures provide. And actually then, at bottom, there isn't any alternative to, we don't throw out the numbers, but there isn't any alternative to some kind of intelligent judgment, some kind of intelligent assessment of things to determine what the evidence means. The evidence does not speak for itself. It speaks to some degree, but any particular system, especially if people know what it is already, is subject to distortion and misrepresentation. It has the potential to drive us away from our goals rather than toward our goals. So anyhow, that's the idealization of the technical field, that removal from politics, that makes perhaps relieves the suspicion that we're altering the rules and cheating, is also, however, leading us to or making us susceptible to many outcomes that we might not like. So. Quetelet's famous phrase, which is not an ancient phrase, but he uttered it in Latin, numbers rule the world. Well, they kind of do, and they can rule it in good ways or bad ways, and if they are given absolute control, it's not going to be easy to get the outcomes that we want. Now, so far I emphasized kind of state, public uses of numbers and the rewards, or the effect of rewards, but this kind of distortion can happen without really the involvement of states. That is somehow the power, the dangerous power, slightly legitimate and yet dangerous function of power can happen in purely, shall I say, market situations. I think of this book by Wendy Espeland and Michael Sauter on American law schools. The one magazine, which had practically failed, then had the brilliant idea of ranking all kinds of things, including law schools, and somehow they remain the only real ranker of law schools. And law schools have become such a thing that students will go to number 9 over number 10, even if it's across the country. So that ranking system became, well, they say, a source of extraordinary anxiety, and really drove the law schools to change what they did in almost every respect. Penetrating to all kinds of things you wouldn't at first imagine, though it all makes sense once it happens. And even despite the fact that almost all the obvious authorities, let's say the law school deans, hated them and said that they were worthless and misrepresenting and driving us to unfortunate policy changes and so on. And yet there they are. Students face a situation of uncertainty. It's nice that students who face a situation of uncertainty have some basis for trying to decide what's the right place to go, but it drove the schools into a kind of a spiral of reshaping themselves in order to get their numbers up and driving some, even kind of out of business. So, if you want to use numbers to to reduce the world to simpler terms. Well, I mean, it is one of the things we want, and yet we have to be careful. Well, I just kind of finish here with a few lessons. If objectivity is supposed to mean something simple and mechanical, something that can be reduced to rules, then it may not be what we want. Maybe I think we may want, we at least want to temper that with other forms of objectivity, and we're not going to get rid of the kind of a judgment. Even these doctors who sometimes didn't seem or don't seem to have the skills that they claim, but they were right in insisting that we need to temper the evidence, not to discard the evidence, the quantitative evidence, but to temper it with interpretation, which statisticians can engage in and do engage in as well. And the idealizing of a single bottom line measure introduces many temptations which can lead to trouble. It may be better to recognize the crucial role of trained judgment after all, even if we never want to simply let unjustified judgment rule things either. So we can't do without it. We can't really manage it. There are no magic solutions, but the pure evidence-driven or data-driven in the sense of something which should be self-subsistent, which can protect us from corruption, that is not going to succeed either. So I offer as my kind of concluding maxim something like, if we're thinking about measuring something in a way which is going to function as a set of incentives, we actually need to think about not only is it a good measure, that is this a measure which tells us about the thing we're trying to understand, but actually also is it a measure, what consequences is this measure going to have for the way the people perform? That is, already having a measure is going to change the way people act. That's a thing which can be exploited to the ends that we desire, but that is a thing which can also perhaps inadvertently lead to well, if not catastrophes, to outcomes we don't desire, as the thing measured becomes the obsession of those measured, and they reorient their activities to improve that measurement and perhaps forget a lot of the things that they once thought were important and still think are important, but which are not included in the measurement. So measuring is highly valuable and very promising, but somehow the measures are themselves actors. The measures are not just objective things standing outside the system which we use to evaluate. They have become actors in the world, and we need to understand them as actors in the world in order to use them to reach the ends that we pursue. Thank you.